It's 6 a.m. on a cold autumn morning in 1350 CE, and you're a 25-year-old barber in the city of Paris. You unlock the heavy wooden door of your shop near the marketplace. The distinctive red and white pole outside your establishment spins slowly in the morning breeze. Inside your leather kit sits an array of steel instruments: razors for shaving, scissors for hair, lancets for bloodletting, forceps for pulling teeth, and a bone saw for amputations. Your first customer arrives clutching his jaw in pain. By noon, you'll have shaved a merchant's beard, extracted 3 rotten teeth, bled a fever patient, and if the town guards arrive with a wounded criminal, you might be sawing off a gangrenous leg before sundown. Welcome to the life of a medieval barber. It's not quite what you'd expect from a modern haircut appointment. Today, we're diving into what daily existence was actually like for the barber-surgeons of medieval Europe. And I'm warning you right now, this is going to shatter any romantic notions you might have about the friendly neighborhood barber. We're talking about men who wielded razors with one hand and surgical saws with the other, who could trim your beard in the morning and amputate your arm in the afternoon, all while navigating a complex world of guild politics, class divisions, and the constant threat of malpractice accusations. Let's start with how you even became a barber. Because if you think modern cosmetology school is challenging, medieval apprenticeship would like a word: the long road to the razor. Your journey to becoming a barber surgeon began when you were barely 12 or 13 years old. Unlike physicians who studied at universities and read Latin texts by Galen and Avicenna, you entered the trade guild system as an apprentice. Your parents paid a substantial fee to a master barber to take you on, often an amount equivalent to several months of a laborer's wages. The apprenticeship lasted anywhere from 7 to 14 years, depending on your location and the guild's requirements. You lived with your master, bound by legal indentures that controlled every aspect of your life. You couldn't marry during your training. You were forbidden from visiting taverns or inns. You worked from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week, learning the craft through observation and endless practice on willing or unwilling subjects. During these years, you learned to handle the fundamental tools of the trade. The straight razor became an extension of your hand as you practiced on countless beards. You mastered the delicate art of using scissors without mangling someone's scalp. You learned to sharpen blades on whetstones until they could split a hair. But your education extended far beyond grooming. You studied the theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Medieval medicine held that imbalance among these humors caused all disease and illness. As a barber, you would become an expert in bloodletting, the primary method for restoring humoral balance. You learned to identify the proper veins to cut, how much blood to extract, and which astrological signs favored bleeding and which forbade it. Medieval calendars marked specific days as ideal for bloodletting based on the phases of the moon and the position of the stars. You practiced extracting teeth on cadavers when you could obtain them, or on the poor who couldn't afford actual physicians. You learned basic wound care, how to clean injuries with wine or vinegar, how to apply poultices of herbs and animal fat, how to stitch lacerations with needle and thread. For more severe cases, you studied cauterization, heating iron rods until they glowed red and pressing them against wounds to seal blood vessels and prevent infection. The more ambitious apprentices learned surgical procedures that went beyond basic care. Trepanation involved drilling or scraping holes into the skull to relieve pressure from head injuries, or to release evil spirits believed to cause madness and seizures. Amputation required speed and precision, cutting through flesh and bone before blood loss killed the patient. Setting broken bones demanded knowledge of anatomy and the strength to physically manipulate fractured limbs back into position. Finally, after years of unpaid labor and grueling training, you completed your apprenticeship by passing an examination administered by the Guild. In some cities like Paris, this examination was rigorous and formal. In others, it was merely a demonstration of competence before the Guild masters. Once certified, you became a journeyman, free to earn wages, but not yet permitted to establish your own shop. The daily grind, a shop of blood and hair. Your typical day as a medieval barber began at dawn. The marketplace near your shop awakened with merchants setting up stalls, calling out their wares, and customers beginning their daily routines. You swept your shop floor, arranged your instruments, and hung basins for collecting blood where customers could see them. These blood-filled bowls in your window served as advertising, proof that you were actively practicing your medical craft. Your first customers of the morning were typically men seeking grooming services. Shaving was a common request among merchants, craftsmen, and anyone who could afford the small fee of a few pence. You lathered their faces with soap made from animal fat and wood ash, then carefully drew your razor across their skin, removing stubble without nicking the flesh beneath. A skilled barber could complete a full shave in minutes. Haircuts followed similar patterns, using scissors to trim and style according to current fashions. But grooming was merely one aspect of your business, and often not the most lucrative. As morning progressed, patients arrived seeking medical treatment. A man with chronic headaches wanted bloodletting to drain the excess blood causing his ailment. You examined his urine in a glass flask, checking its color and consistency against charts that supposedly revealed internal imbalances. Finding it too dark, you agreed that bleeding was necessary. You seated him in a chair, tied a leather strap around his upper arm to make the vein prominent, and made a quick incision with your lancet. Dark blood flowed into the waiting basin. You measured carefully, draining approximately half a pint while the patient grew pale and lightheaded. When sufficient blood had been taken, you pressed a clean cloth against the wound and bound it tightly. The patient paid his fee and departed, hopefully improved, though more likely weakened from blood loss. A woman arrived next with a rotten tooth, causing her excruciating pain. Tooth extraction was among your most common and most dreaded procedures. Without anesthesia, beyond perhaps a cup of strong ale, or a mixture of opium and hemlock if you could afford such luxuries, the procedure was agony for the patient. You had them sit or stand while you gripped the offending tooth with your forceps, bracing yourself against their shoulder, and pulled with all your strength. The tooth came free with a sickening crack, blood filling their mouth as they screamed. You packed the socket with cloth soaked in wine to prevent infection and collected your fee. The afternoon might bring a variety of cases. A laborer with an infected wound on his leg needed lancing. You cut open the abscess with a scalpel, draining foul-smelling pus and blood, then cleaned it with vinegar and applied a poultice of herbs. A child burned their hand on a cooking fire and needed the blistered skin dressed. A drunk fell and dislocated his shoulder, requiring you to manipulate the joint back into place while he howled in pain. When the razor meets the battlefield, the most intensive and horrific work for any barber-surgeon came during times of war. When armies marched and battles raged, barber-surgeons followed the troops, providing the only medical care available to wounded soldiers. This was where your skills were tested most severely, and where the line between barber and surgeon became indistinguishable. On the battlefield or in makeshift field hospitals, you faced injuries unlike anything in civilian practice. Sword wounds cut deep into muscle and bone. Arrows pierced through armor and flesh, their barbed heads impossible to remove without causing massive damage. Crushing blows from maces shattered skulls and limbs. Infection spread rapidly in the unsanitary conditions of military camps. Amputation became routine. When gangrene set into a crushed leg or an arrow wound festered beyond salvation, removing the limb was the only option. You worked with brutal efficiency, using leather straps to tourniquet the limb above the cut. Your saw cut through bone in less than a minute, while assistants held the screaming soldier down. The severed limb fell away, and you immediately cauterized the stump with heated irons, the smell of burning flesh filling the tent. If the patient survived the shock and blood loss, they faced weeks of recovery and a lifetime of disability. You treated head wounds by performing trepanation, drilling carefully into fractured skulls to relieve pressure from bleeding beneath the bone. You extracted arrows by cutting around the entry wound and pushing the arrow through rather than pulling it backward against its barbs. You sutured gaping sword cuts, packed wounds with bandages, and did everything possible to prevent the infections that killed more soldiers than the injuries themselves. Military campaigns also provided opportunities for professional advancement. Successful barber surgeons who saved the lives of important knights or nobles might be rewarded with positions in royal courts or noble households. Some, like the famous Ambroise Paré, who served multiple French kings, revolutionized surgical techniques through battlefield experience. Paré pioneered the use of ligatures to tie off arteries during amputation rather than cauterization, dramatically improving survival rates. The social ladder, despised yet essential. Here's the contradiction at the heart of being a medieval barber surgeon. Society simultaneously needed you desperately and looked down upon you with contempt. Physicians who studied at universities and could quote ancient medical texts in Latin considered themselves intellectuals far above the manual labor of surgery. They diagnosed conditions and prescribed treatments, but refused to touch patients themselves. Cutting into flesh or handling blood was beneath their dignity. The 1215 Fourth Lateran Council explicitly forbade clergy from performing surgery, declaring contact with blood and bodily fluids contaminating to men of the church. This created a massive gap in medical care. Physicians might tell a patient they needed an infected limb removed, but they wouldn't perform the operation. That task fell to you, the barber surgeon, along with all the other messy, painful, hands-on procedures that medicine required. You were the one who actually treated people. Yet this practical necessity didn't translate to social respect. Physicians, poets, and the educated classes mocked barbers as crude tradesmen who meddled in medicine without proper knowledge. You were portrayed in popular culture as bungling, greedy, and dangerous. Satires depicted barbers as butchers who mangled their patients as often as they helped them. The patients themselves viewed you with ambivalence. The wealthy who could afford physicians used you only when absolutely necessary or for routine services like bleeding that physicians refused to perform. The poor, peasants, workers, and soldiers had no choice. When a laborer suffered a crushed hand or a soldier took an arrow to the shoulder, you were their only hope. They came to you out of necessity, not preference. Guild membership provided some protection and legitimacy. By the 13th century, barber surgeons began organizing formal guilds in London, Paris, and other major cities. These guilds regulated training through the apprenticeship system, set standards for practice, controlled prices, and protected members from competition. In 1540, King Henry VIII granted a royal charter uniting barbers and surgeons in London into the Company of Barber-Surgeons, providing official recognition, but also revealing the continued separation from physicians. Within the guild hierarchy, status varied considerably. Master barbers who owned their own shops and employed apprentices earned respectable middle-class incomes. Successful practitioners in wealthy urban areas might treat merchants, guild masters, and minor nobility, accumulating enough wealth to live comfortably. The red and white pole outside your shop symbolized your profession, the red representing blood, the white representing bandages, and the pole itself representing the staff patients gripped during bloodletting. But many barber surgeons struggled financially, especially those in rural areas, or those just starting their careers as journeymen. You earned fees for each service, collecting a few pence for a shave, several pence for bloodletting, and larger sums for surgical procedures. However, patients often couldn't or wouldn't pay. Collection was a constant struggle. Some barbers supplemented their income by selling remedies, ointments, and herbal preparations alongside their services. The legacy of blood and skill. Despite the poverty, danger, and social stigma, medieval barber surgeons were revolutionary in ways that shaped modern medicine. You were the practitioners who actually touched patients, who learned anatomy through hands-on experience rather than ancient texts. While physicians debated theories in Latin, you stitched wounds, set bones, and saved lives through practical skill. Your battlefield experience advanced surgical techniques. Your tools evolved to become more precise and effective, and your accumulated knowledge of the human body surpassed academic theory. By 1371 in France, barber surgeons had gained so much practical expertise that they actually surpassed university-trained surgeons in knowledge and capability. This paradox, where those with the least formal education possessed the most practical skill, eventually forced changes in how surgery was taught and practiced. The apprenticeship system you endured, brutal as it was, created competent practitioners through years of supervised practice. The guild structure, despite its restrictions, maintained standards and protected both practitioners and patients. The blend of grooming and medical services made you accessible to all levels of society, democratizing healthcare in ways that university-trained physicians never could. Life was hard, bloody, and often thankless. You rose before dawn to open your shop. You spent your days alternating between the mundane task of trimming beards and the horrific necessity of sawing off limbs. You faced constant criticism from physicians who considered you their inferior, even as you performed the work they refused to do. You struggled to collect payment from patients who begrudged every penny. And you did all of this knowing that one mistake, one patient who died under your care, could destroy your reputation and livelihood. But you also possessed skills that could save lives. Your razor could bring comfort through a clean shave. Your forceps could end the agony of a rotten tooth. Your saw could prevent a spreading infection from killing its victim. You stood at the intersection of daily life and medical crisis, equally comfortable trimming a merchant's beard and treating a soldier's battlefield wound. The medieval barber surgeon embodied this duality: despised craftsman and essential healer, groomer and surgeon, tradesman and medical professional. This figure, with razor in one hand and scalpel in the other, laid the foundation for the separation of barbering and surgery that would eventually transform both professions. The next time you pass a barber shop with its spinning red and white pole, remember what that symbol once meant: and the men who wielded both razors and surgical instruments in an age when blood and hair were equally part of the day's work.